Hello, today is December 20th. The topic is nationalism in an age of interdependence. But before I start talking to you about it, I just want to say I'm going to take a brief holiday. And the next recording, the next Ali Talk will be recorded on January 24th. And then in February, I'll go back to every 2 weeks. The one after that is February 7th and then February 21. So the next recording, in case you're hunting for it, will be January 24th. So nationalism is rearing its head as a very major topic internationally again. And before I talk about the current issues, I think we need a few definitions here because words are thrown around in ways that don't necessarily clarify what is going on. So let us first talk about what is a state in international affairs. The modern state system pretty much started up as far back as the 17th century, actually, after the Treaty of Westphalia. And the idea was that, there had been city-states and large territorial states and so forth, that one would now aim for national states. And states have been defined and are defined as we speak in legal terms. So what is a state? A state is a territory, a defined territory, with a government that has reasonable capacity to govern domestically, but also has the capacity to deal on behalf of that state with other states internationally. Now, there are other wrinkles there, but I think it's important to bear in mind that a state is a legal category. It's not a cultural or emotional one. And in modern times, how do you become a state? Well, you have the characteristics of a state, and you essentially ask other states to recognize you as a state. And if they recognize you as a state, then you have the status of a legal state in the international order. So how does that work nowadays? Well, somebody, let's say, was a colony or part of another country. They want to be an independent, quote, sovereign state. How do you and I know that they have become such? When the United Nations recognizes and admits that state and hoists that state's flag up its flagpole. So now we have close to 200 independent sovereign states. And they are, and I'll talk about sovereignty in a minute, and they are range from, little islands with a few 100,000 people to, China and India with over 1 billion people. So it doesn't say how large you have to be. It just has to say that you have to have those characteristics. Now, has anybody ever claimed to be a state and get recognized that wasn't recognized? Yes, let me just give you one example. During the apartheid time in South Africa, white South Africans were getting sick of the claims of various Black ethnic groups wanting to participate in politics. And they had the bright idea to take some places in the desert and say, this is now your state. You're now, an independent state. No one bought that internationally. And when the South Africa forced the heads that they put in charge of these small territories, told them to apply to membership in the United Nations. The United Nations says this is phony baloney, this is not a state and we won't recognize it. So actual recognition has to take place that it has the characteristics. Now, another complicated issue because sovereignty, the idea comes from the sovereign, right, who ruled. Nowadays, they mostly are not the sovereigns in any event. They don't mostly exercise quote unquote sovereignty. So you have it transferred either through constitution, like in the United States and many other countries, and parliaments and so forth. They inhabit the sovereignty aspects of the state. They make the decision on behalf of the state, both internally and externally. The degree to which a state, for example, that is under authoritarian control or just had a coup, is in the position to speak for that state, those are complicated international and political issues, and I won't detain us with that. So then the question is, what is a nation? And it's a terribly interesting subject. There are literally hundreds of books written on this subject. They're really interesting, and many academics like myself used to teach courses on nationalism. So, what is a nation? At the end of the day, a nation is a group of people who believe themselves to belong together. A group of people who believe themselves to belong together. And why do they believe themselves to belong together? It can have all kinds of reasons. History, language, religion, a multiplicity of these things. And sometimes in sort of common parlance, the idea is that a nation has to have a single language and a single religion, all of that too. That is sometimes argued and sometimes exists in reality. But in point of fact, you can be your citizens can feel a strong sense of national identity and be a nation to have none of these. Language is often proffered as an example. You have to have a common language to be a nation. Well, in Switzerland, they don't have a common language. They speak 3 different languages. And if you've ever been to Switzerland, the Swiss feel very strongly that they're Swiss. They're not Germans or French or something. They are Swiss. So they have a sense of national identity. So the variables as what makes you feel you have a sense of national identity can be a multiplicity or even a single factor. Now, what makes a nation state? Because nowadays we talk about nation states, a hyphenated nation state. And the ideal that arose over the last few centuries is that this most stable type of state is that it has people living inside of it that believe themselves to belong together. And the stronger that hyphen is, the more stable that state is the theory and to some extent the historical practice of it all. So countries that are, let's say, new countries that have been, let's say, former colonies and so forth, they may be recognized as legal states. And they may think of themselves as nation states, but we look at them and think, actually, they don't seem to be have a very coherent national identity. I mean, take a country like Nigeria, which looks like it might even fall apart, where the North and the South and the West, the different groups want autonomy from the central government and are conflicted over it. Or take the former Soviet Union, which was made up of a variety of states, but it was a single government under the Soviet system. When the Soviet Union broke up, some of the parts that were states became independent sovereign nation states. And one of the issues in front of us right now is the Ukraine, right? It was part of the Soviet Union, but it then became an independent, recognized state. And it has many of the attributes of a nation state. So things come and go sometimes, and groups inside states sometimes break up and make their own states legal in international, have to be recognized in international law, and often are even nation states. That is to say, the people living in them actually believe that they belong together. I know this sounds complex and sort of academic, but with all the stuff that's thrown around, I think it's important to have a kind of clear delineation of it. There's one thing I left out, I guess, and that is, what about people who believe themselves to belong together, but they don't have a state? Can we think of people like that? Yes, we can. For example, the Kurds, right? The Kurds live in Iraq, the Kurds live all over the Middle East pretty much, and the Kurds think of themselves as a single people, as have the Armenians historically, right? But they didn't have a legally recognized state, and they sprawled around. And they have been aiming, in some cases, for decades or even longer than that. They've been aiming to become a nation state. That is to say, they're a nation first who wish to become, in the legal sense, a territory with a government and so forth that governs itself. So you have two processes here. You have states that have multiple nations inside of them, and the adherence to the state is not strong enough to keep them from falling apart and leading to separatist movements and eventually more states. And at the same time, you have nations of people who have all the characteristics of a nation, who are sprawled in different states in which they really don't feel that they are part of the national identity, and therefore they would like to have the political unit. So sometimes you have the political unit first that leads to the nation. Sometimes you have a nation that's seeking a political unit, and sometimes you have messy in-between situations which are fairly destabilizing. However, after the Second World War, right, if you looked at the map at the time, and some of you may have old maps, you saw that 2/3 of the world were not, in fact, independent sovereign states, but they were colonies, right? And how did you see that on the map? Different colors for different colonial empires. Once you had decolonization take place, you got these more and more and more states. Very often, the colonies then became states, but the colonies themselves were not always rational in terms of containing groups of people who believed themselves to belong together. So either you needed to find a national identity on top of the multiple identities. That is to say, differences of language, differences of ethnic identities, religion, but the state needed to create a sense of national identity. And some states have managed to do so, and some states have not. And there have been very many different avenues to achieve this. For example, some former colonies leap to mind, for example, India, which uses English as a national language to help tie the diversity and the various subgroups in the society, the various states, provinces inside the country together. And there are other countries like that. After the Second World War, also the idea arose that many of the wars were caused by the conflicts of different states with each other, sometimes for territory, sometimes for other reasons. And one of the ways to reduce wars and conflict was to link states together and have sovereign states to move into areas of federalism of a sort that would allow them to act jointly, and that those joint actions would be important enough to each of the units that they wouldn't want to go to war with each other. So, for example, the European Union, right? The idea of the European Union was, all right, if all these European countries acted together and the Union itself had functions, laws, regulations, treaty arrangements, and so forth with the outside world, then you group people together in a way that eventually would lead to some form of loose federalism, maybe even the United States of Europe down the road or something. Many institutions all over the world, I don't have the time to go into all of them, all have attempted over time to create multinational, multi-state institutions, which are meant to integrate people, make them engage in overlapping activities so that it would be costly to have wars and conflicts with each other. What does that mean for the capacity of a state to be sovereign and make its own rules? Well, states who joined the European Union, but even states like the United States who make treaties, agree to act collectively or according to some new treaty, and in a sense hobble themselves in terms of independent action, not totally autonomous, right? So is in the body of international law, which is a law among states that sovereign states have agreed to adhere to, hobbles their attempt to act unilaterally in areas in which they have voluntarily given up the state's ability to act unilaterally. Okay, so there was a strong move for decades in many parts of the world, and certainly in Europe. More states joined the European Union one way or another. There was, NATO in the military sense, where countries agreed under certain circumstances that NATO could act without first going back to the states. I mean, of course, nowadays they consult and so forth. But theoretically, at least, each of the states agreed that under NATO, if one of the countries was attacked, NATO could respond immediately, and then, of course, later consult and so forth. At least in a conventional way. This did not prevail for nuclear use of nuclear capacity. Now, one of the other many confusions, of course, is that something like the United States, right? Our states are not sovereign states. It's more helpful, for example, in Canada, they're called provinces and so forth. And of course, one of the reasons the UN is called United Nations, even though it should really be United States, is because the United States exists, and it becomes very confusing, right? So nation sometimes is used inappropriately. But what you have in the UN is not nations uniting, but nation states uniting, with the emphasis on states. Some of them are firm nations, some of them are multinational, and so forth. Now, I know this is a long prologue, but it kind of helps to understand this, because in most recent times, nationalism has reared its head. Brexit, for example. Great Britain voted to get out of the European Union. They didn't want the institutions of the European Union to make rules that they didn't like, so they got out of it. There are many countries who are not adhering to international law, which oblige them to act in certain ways. That includes the United States, for example, in the area of human rights, immigration, the treatment of people in Guantanamo, all of those kinds of things are contrary to international law, which the United States had agreed to adhere to, and is not adhering to it. And in the case of the United States, what can you do about it? Now, there are many treaties which oblige countries to not act independently and act collectively. Some of them are very obscure. For example, airline regulations, right? There's this international law, which you can, international postal stuff. That's all regulated by international treaties, and countries give up some of their national rights to act independently. When they don't want to act independently, they either leave, or in the case of the United States, very often ignore things. There are many other wrinkles, and at some point down the line, I'm going to talk about international law. But let me just say, what is it we should ask ourselves to have created a situation where for some decades after the Second World War, everybody was looking for ways to act collectively and to give some of the national authority over to collective action in order to prevent future conflicts, make the world smoother, in other words, short circuit potential conflicts and actions and so forth. And what is it in the late 20th century and in the 21st century that is making some of this system unravel? And it's interesting because there's nationalism everywhere, right? It's Iran, it's in the Middle East, it's in Europe, Brexit, it's Russia, now saying, "Oh, the Ukraine should really be part of it. We lost part of our nation. We shouldn't have given it up." It's Ukrainian nationalism. We are a separate entity. We have a national identity that's separate from the Russians. Every day we open the newspapers, and there's stuff about nationalism being invoked, sometimes for good purposes, sometimes for bad purposes. And it's a genuine turnaround in a way, because the ideology and the theory, if not always the practice, had been for some decades, is to tampen down nationalism. That is to say, the ideology, the ism, not tampen down the idea of the nation state, but the ism, which then undermines collective action, right? The ideology which says, we're British Isles, we don't want any part of the European Union anymore. European Union is if some party gets into power in some other EU countries, might they also say, we don't like this regulation for trade or fishing or monetary regulations or whatever, and we want out, right? So the system looks very porous right now. It looks like it's sort of falling apart. And then that begs the question of why. Well, there are many whys, but there's some obvious whys. And one of the odd things, I think, is, but it's worth thinking about whether you think I'm making sense, is that the interdependence of the world has radically increased. And the interdependence of the world has, in a sense, freaked people out, that they're losing, people, I mean governments, that they're losing control. Some of the interdependence has to do, with trade treaties, with labor moving around, with the interdependence, for example, of the supply chains right now, which is much covered in our news, right? And what is the U.S. government saying? Members of Congress, even the Biden administration, we've got to produce things back home ourselves so that these things can happen. So for decades, the idea was, you piece things together that were produced all over the world, wherever labor was cheap or where the resources existed. And then the bits and pieces of, let's say, a car or even a piece of clothing was, the cotton was produced somewhere, the cloth somewhere else, the garment was produced yet another country, and eventually it was shipped to yet another country and appeared in stores. So the world has gotten increasingly interdependent in commerce, right? In labor that is moving around in one kind or another. And in terms of climate change, where everybody is aware of the fact that climate is somehow a global problem, but countries are being very nationalistic in terms of saying, we really don't want to commit ourselves very firmly to this or that, or we have, national issues. This could even be local, right? Never mind that the U.S. has major climate issues, but there's one senator who represents the coal industry, and never mind those climate pollution reductions. He's looking out after, the folks that elected him and so forth. So both internal to states as well as external states, states are increasingly saying, whoa, we need to pull back from this. We're too interlinked. And if you're really interlinked, well, maybe it will deter war, as they thought historically, but also it might handicap our consumers, our economy, our capability to fish in waters, that we don't like the regulation that you can't overfish that we've agreed to with other countries. We want to fish whatever we want to fish. So we're pulling back. So the idea of reducing nationalism in many ways, the ism part, and acting collectively, acting internationally and globally, which accelerated in the second half of the 20th century, is, as we speak now, slowly unraveling. And big states and small states are saying, never mind, we don't want to agree with other states. All right, maybe we'll lead to conflict. We'll worry about that later. But we don't want to be told by bureaucrats from organizations, what to do. Um, Now, one of the confusions, of course, in this whole discussion for the U.S. is that we are a nation state in the formal sense of the word, and the president and Congress and the courts and our institution. But then we have all these states, and historically we've had states' rights folks. We still have them who are saying the federal government should not, let's say, tell me in Arkansas to get vaccinated against COVID. That should be a local decision, should maybe even be my autonomous decision. So there's confusion always in the minds of us Americans because we have states that are not international sovereign states, but we call them states. They have certain rights. That's also true in other countries. Provinces have certain rights, sub-states, areas have certain rights. But so we shouldn't get confused as Americans about that. But we're talking about the kind of nationalism and the kind of world we have created through decolonization and through the celebration of ethnic identities, that even states that look very firm, some states in Europe, take an obvious example, Spain, right? Spain looks like a coherent country, has existed forever, but there are subgroups. They speak their own languages. They have a sense of identity. They might not like what the central government is doing. So, for example, the Basque or the Catalonians or so forth, and they say, oh, we might want to become an independent state. Now, very often this is politics that doesn't lead to independent sovereign states that are recognized by the UN, and many of these places are not viable. Still in all, there are very large states, again, let me name Nigeria, which may very well fall apart. And then how viable will the subgroups be? And Nigeria is a very big, we're talking millions, right? 200 million people sometime down the road. Will the local states fall apart and seek to become internationally recognized sovereign states? They can then claim we have a sense of national identity, a language, a religion, a history, a culture, and so forth that's different than these other people. But still in all, the UN and all the members of the UN may have to think carefully whether they want a world of not just 200 states, but 250 or 300 states somewhere down the road, which goes completely counter to the idea that you want to reduce sort of internal national identities that can go into hostile relationships and maybe war again, send some drones over, or have creepy terrorist groups. Terrorism is now a big thing all over, right? These terrorist groups are trying to fight against being internal to the national identity, fighting against the governments that they believe are authoritarian or don't represent them, and so forth. So it's getting extremely messy out there. And of course, one of the, to get almost back to the beginning for just 60 seconds, one of the identifying characteristics of the ism nationalism was that the people who live within a territory believed themselves to belong together, right? And you have very many multinational states where people at some level believe themselves to belong together, but at other levels also still have their local identities, like their languages and their religions and so forth. And in a world in which you don't get satisfaction from your government, you may be an authoritarian government and so forth, you might very well then argue in favor of breaking up and fighting to break up. So the nation state formed over some centuries, some of those states, especially former colonial entities, might very well break up. There's one other wrinkle that I want to add on, and that is that because of climate change and other things, economy, climate change making it impossible for people to make a living where they used to make a living, floods, rising sea levels, and all the rest. More and more as we move into the century, there will be more and more so-called refugees and immigrants. And that's a topic of itself. But what it does mean is that states which were pretty coagulated nation states now either welcome and they're people from very different cultures, languages, religions, or don't welcome them, and is creating a big crisis in the world. Even, nice homogeneous Scandinavian countries now have, quite a lot of people from very different societies. You take, let's say, a Sweden, which is just full of, Ethiopians and Somalis and Eritreans, and now there's Syrians and so forth. And these people do, in fact, come from a very different culture. Now, in the US, we're used to immigration. And until we became sort of the here and now slightly right-wing country on immigration, we used to believe that after a generation or so, the immigrants would themselves become Americanized, right, of their own volition. It's actually still happening, but the propaganda says it's not happening. And so we come from so many backgrounds that our identity is that we're a country of immigrants. The same thing is true of Canada, of Australia, and so forth. But for many countries, that was not the case. And so the question arises for the future, which again, we'll talk about more in the new year, is the whole immigration issue worldwide. But those immigration issues and people's identity, which they thought was firm, they believe themselves to belong together, and all of a sudden there are new people who don't seem to belong, and those people may or may not want to belong, which would then require the nation state to redefine itself. So in that sense, nationalism, which is my final point, is also very newly on the agenda, because of climate change, because of global interdependence in the economy now, because of the movement of people, and the final point, of course, even because of the virus. Because obviously in modern times, we see how quickly these viruses spread and how interdependent we are. So we're caught in a vice right now. People in their psyches and souls want to have a sense of national identity and want to get away from interdependence. And at the same time, the forces of the 21st century makes us all more interdependent than we've ever been before. So I wish you happy holidays, and I'll see you towards the end of January, to be specific, on January 24th. Bye.